princess finds herself in a kingdom plagued by despair and loss. The once thriving land is now shrouded in darkness, and its people have lost hope. The princess witnesses the suffering of her subjects and feels a deep sense of responsibility to bring back the light. One night, the princess has a vivid and mysterious vision that fills her heart with a glimmer of hope. In this vision, she sees herself embarking on a heroic journey to restore hope to her kingdom. Encouraged by this vision, she sets out on a quest, guided by an inner calling. Despite the challenges and uncertainties that lie ahead, the princess gathers her strength and makes a courageous decision to leave the comfort of her palace. She knows that she must go beyond the familiar walls and face the unknown to fulfill her destiny. With a loyal companion by her side, the princess begins her journey. They traverse through treacherous landscapes, encountering obstacles and meeting diverse characters along the way. Each step brings them closer to their goal and tests their determination. As the princess travels, she encounters individuals who have experienced their own trials and triumphs. Through their stories, she learns of their resilience and the power of hope. These tales inspire her and strengthen her resolve to bring hope back to her kingdom. Despite her noble intentions, the princess faces her own inner struggles and doubts. She questions whether she has the strength and wisdom to fulfill the prophecy. Yet, she learns that it is through facing these doubts and embracing her vulnerability that she can truly grow. Along her journey, the princess learns that loss is an inevitable part of life. She witnesses the pain and grief of her people, and it deepens her understanding of their suffering. Through this empathy, she becomes even more determined to bring hope and healing to their lives. The princess discovers that even small acts of kindness can have a profound impact. She extends a helping hand to those she meets, offering comfort, support, and encouragement. These acts of compassion bring a glimmer of hope to individuals and communities, igniting a spark of positivity. As the princess ventures through untamed landscapes, she develops a deep bond with nature. She finds solace in the whispering trees, the gentle wind caress, and the blooming flowers' beauty. Nature becomes her ally, reminding her of the cycles of life and the resilience found in the natural world. In an ancient library, the princess stumbles upon a forgotten prophecy. It speaks of her role in restoring hope to her kingdom and foretells the challenges she must overcome. This revelation strengthens her resolve and gives her a sense of purpose on her quest. The princess encounters individuals who have lost all hope, consumed by despair. She listens to their stories, offering compassion and understanding. Through her presence and words of encouragement, she plants seeds of hope in their hearts, reigniting a flicker of belief in a better future. The princess realizes that her kingdom has become fragmented and divided. She works tirelessly to bridge the gaps, seeking common ground and promoting understanding among its people. Through dialogue and empathy, she fosters a sense of unity and collective purpose. The princess discovers the healing power of music and dance. She organizes gatherings where people come together, rhythmically moving their bodies and expressing their emotions through melodies. These joyous moments uplift spirits, fostering a sense of community and igniting hope. The princess confronts the shadows of the past that haunt her kingdom. She delves into the history of her land, acknowledging the mistakes and injustices that have transpired. Through acknowledgement and reconciliation, she paves the way for healing and a brighter future. Realizing the importance of knowledge, the princess establishes schools and libraries throughout her kingdom. She ensures that education is accessible to all, empowering her people with the tools to shape their own destinies. Education becomes a beacon of hope, illuminating the path to a better tomorrow. The princess becomes a storyteller, sharing tales of hope and resilience. She gathers people around campfires, in town squares, and in humble abodes, narrating stories of ordinary individuals. The princess encounters kindred spirits who share her vision of restoring hope. They join her quest, bringing their unique skills and perspectives. Together, they form a united front, inspiring and supporting one another in their mission. In a remote village, the princess discovers elders who hold ancient wisdom and forgotten knowledge. She humbly learns from their teachings, gleaning insights that can guide her on her path. This wisdom becomes a source of strength and guidance as she navigates the challenges ahead. The princess witnesses the unbreakable spirit of children who, despite the hardships they face, radiate innocence and resilience. She vows to protect their dreams and provide them with a brighter future. Their unwavering hope becomes a driving force in her quest. In the darkest moments of despair, the princess discovers a small glimmer of light, a symbol of resilience and hope. She follows this light, which leads her to a hidden sanctuary where a community of resilient individuals has been preserving hope. Their presence strengthens her determination to carry on. The princess confronts the oppressive forces that have contributed to her kingdom's despair. She fearlessly challenges systems of injustice, advocating for equality and fairness. Her actions inspire others to rise up and join the fight for a more just society. The princess realizes that healing can only occur through forgiveness and reconciliation. She initiates a process of truth and reconciliation, where individuals and communities can share their stories and find closure. This transformative journey paves the way for healing and unity. The princess encourages her people to embrace their creative potential as a means of healing and self-expression. Artists, writers, and musicians emerge, using their talents to inspire hope and evoke emotions. The kingdom becomes a hub of creativity, fostering a vibrant atmosphere of renewal. The princess becomes a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring her people to believe in a brighter future. Her unwavering determination and compassionate leadership uplift spirits and ignite a collective sense of purpose. The kingdom rallies behind her, ready to face any challenge together. The princess recognizes the strength of diversity and actively promotes inclusivity within her kingdom. She celebrates different cultures, beliefs, and perspectives, fostering a sense of unity in their shared humanity. Through embracing diversity, the kingdom becomes stronger and more resilient. Throughout her journey, the princess undergoes a profound transformation. She evolves from a hesitant and uncertain individual into a confident and visionary leader. Her personal growth inspires others to embark on their own journeys of self-discovery and transformation. The princess sparks an era of innovation and progress within her kingdom. She encourages the development of new technologies, sustainable practices, and entrepreneurial endeavors. This spirit of innovation drives economic growth and creates opportunities for her people to thrive. The princess and her allies face a formidable adversary who seeks to extinguish their newfound hope. They engage in a battle that extends beyond physical combat. It is a battle of ideologies and values. Through their resilience and unwavering hope, they emerge victorious, proving that hope is indeed indestructible. In a climactic moment, the princess makes a selfless sacrifice for the greater good of her kingdom. Her act of bravery and love inspires her people to carry on her legacy and continue the quest for hope. Her sacrifice becomes a testament to the power of selflessness and the enduring nature of hope. The princess's unwavering efforts come to fruition as her kingdom enters a new era of hope and prosperity. The scars of the past begin to heal, and the people embrace a future filled with possibilities. The princess's journey has not only restored hope but has also united her kingdom, making it stronger and more resilient than ever before. As the princess travels through remote villages, she discovers ancient traditions that have been forgotten over time. She recognizes the value of these cultural practices and works to revive them. The revival of these traditions brings a sense of pride and identity to her people, further fueling their hope. Despite her successes, the princess battles moments of self-doubt and uncertainty. She questions whether she is worthy of the task she has undertaken. However, through the support of her companions and the unwavering belief of her people, she learns to overcome her self-doubt and embrace her inner strength. In the depths of nature, the princess finds solace and healing. She spends time in serene forests, beside tranquil rivers, and atop majestic mountains. The beauty and tranquility of the natural world rejuvenate her spirit and remind her of the resilience and cycles of life. The princess organizes grand festivals and celebrations to bring her people together. Colorful parades, lively music, and delicious feasts fill the kingdom with joy and camaraderie. These festivities serve as a powerful reminder of the collective spirit and the resilience of the human heart. Along her journey, the princess is confronted by her deepest fears. She must face them head-on, drawing upon her inner courage and resilience. By conquering her fears, she not only grows as an individual but also inspires her people to confront their own fears and limitations. The princess encounters a wise mentor who guides her on her path. This mentor imparts wisdom, challenges her assumptions, and provides valuable guidance. Through their teachings, the princess gains new perspectives and learns to navigate the complexities of her quest. The princess becomes a voice for the voiceless, championing justice and equality. She stands against corruption and fights for the rights of the marginalized. Her unwavering commitment to justice inspires her people to join her in the battle for a fair and compassionate society. During her journey, the princess discovers a wellspring of inner magic within herself. This magic is not rooted in supernatural abilities but in her capacity for love, compassion, and resilience. She learns that true magic lies in the human spirit and its ability to bring about positive change. As the princess witnesses the devastation caused by despair, she sets out to rebuild her kingdom with hope and determination. Together with her people, she reconstructs homes, revitalizes the economy, and creates a supportive infrastructure. The physical rebuilding mirrors the collective healing and renewal happening within her kingdom. Along her journey, the princess is reunited with loved ones she had lost hope of seeing again. The joyous reunions serve as a reminder of the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. These reunions fuel the princess's determination to bring hope to all her people. The princess establishes a legacy of hope within her kingdom. She institutes programs and initiatives that ensure the ongoing support and well-being of her people. This legacy serves as a constant reminder that hope is not a fleeting emotion but a sustainable force that can transform lives and communities. At pivotal moments in her journey, the princess takes time for reflection. She looks back on her experiences, acknowledging her growth and the lessons she has learned. These moments of introspection deepen her understanding of herself and her purpose, fueling her determination to continue her quest. The princess recognizes that change is an inherent part of life. She encourages her people to embrace change and adapt to new circumstances. By fostering a culture of adaptability, the kingdom becomes resilient in the face of challenges, ensuring a sustainable and hopeful future. After a long and arduous journey, the princess returns to her kingdom, transformed and filled with wisdom. The sight of her kingdom, now filled with renewed hope, fills her heart with joy and gratitude. Her people welcome her with open arms, celebrating her triumphant return. Knowing that her time as a leader will come to an end, the princess prepares to pass the torch of hope to the next generation. She mentors young leaders, sharing her experiences and guiding them on their own paths. She entrusts them with the responsibility of continuing the quest for hope. With her mission complete, the princess takes a moment to reflect on her transformative journey. She realizes that the quest for hope was not just for her own kingdom but for her own growth and understanding. She acknowledges the profound impact her journey has had on her own character and the profound connections she has made with her people. The princess looks forward to a new beginning, not just for herself but for her kingdom and the world. She envisions a future where hope is not a fleeting concept but a guiding principle that drives individuals and societies to create positive change. With her unwavering spirit and the legacy she has built, she knows that the flame of hope will continue to burn brightly. The princess's journey and the hope she has ignited create a ripple effect that extends far beyond her kingdom. Her story inspires people from distant lands to embark on their own quests for hope and change. The ripples of hope spread, connecting individuals and communities in a shared vision for a better world. Though the princess's journey may have come to an end, the flame of hope she has ignited will never fade. It will continue to burn in the hearts of her people, guiding them through adversity and inspiring them to create a brighter future. The eternal flame of hope becomes a symbol of resilience, reminding all who encounter it of the power of the human spirit. As the story of the princess comes to a close, it becomes evident that her journey is just the beginning of a larger narrative. The quest for hope and the pursuit of a better world continues in the hearts and actions of those she has touched. The legacy of the princess lives on, forever inspiring generations to come.